Hi 300. Today we're going to talk about fluency. Fluent reading comprises three key elements: accurate reading of connected texts at a conversational rate with appropriate prosody expression. There's two great articles that are explain fluency, and when we're finished with this PowerPoint, I want you to click on them and read them. We all love reading rockets. They're short and to the point, and they're easy to understand too. So I think there'll be a great review on fluency. There are three parts of fluency: accuracy, rate, and prosody. You're probably wondering, what is accuracy? Well, that's the easiest one. Accuracy just means reading accurately, so that the reader reads everything as written in the text. Why do we say rate and not speed? That's one of my personal teaching pet peeves, and it really has come about in the last 5 to 10 years that suddenly speed was equated with good reading. And we all know just because you can read something fast doesn't mean you can read it well. So we're going to listen to one of my favorite reading researchers, Dr. Rosinsky. If you can't hear him well, don't worry about it. You can listen to him again when this PowerPoint is over, because you have the link. Let me turn the volume up. And he is adorable. He's talking about a question about is speed reading good reading?
Gaby was, can fluency ever get in the way of comprehension? And I have to say yes. Well, it depends. It depends upon how you define fluency. Schools around the country define fluency, well-meaning schools, as reading fast, and in which case I think then it would get in the way of comprehension. When kids have got the idea that it's all about reading fast, they're not really paying attention to meaning. On the other hand, I define reading fluency as reading not only automatically, I don't call it fast reading, I call it automatic reading, and reading with expression. And when kids, if you think about it, somebody who's a fluent speaker speaks with expression. When a child is given a chance to practice to read with expression, they really have to monitor the meaning. And so in that way, it's not interfering with comprehension. I think it's actually fostering comprehension. But as I said, it all depends on how you approach fluency. Fluency to me is only worth teaching if it fosters comprehension. And I think working on that in that sort of way will help. And I'll let John tell you the rest.
Okay. Let's get back to our PowerPoint here. So one of the things that Dr. Rosinsky mentioned was this idea of automaticity and knowing words automatically, and how that helps both the accuracy and the rate of your reading. So what is automaticity? So the best way that I can describe this is, have you ever driven to work and then all of a sudden you're at work and you're like, holy moly, how did I get here? That's because it's one of those things you do every single day and you don't think about it. And that's what the idea of automaticity is. You know, when you first started driving, you were like hand over hand, left turn, blinker on, and you were saying all those things in your head, but you don't think that now. You just automatically do those things. And that's how it is when you're a reader. So when you're an emergent reader, you're thinking about vowels and consonants and what sounds they make, and you're trying to sound words out, and you're thinking to yourself, does that look right? Does it sound right? Does it make sense? But automaticity is quick and effortless identification of words in or out of context. They just look at the word and they know it. And that's what you are as a reader. All 99.9% of your vocabulary is automatic. You know those words. Unless you're reading a really hard physics or biology textbook, you're reading pretty much every single word automatically. And the more words students have in their sight word vocabulary, then the easier it is to read in an appropriate rate. And this is why we do a ton of modeling in pre-K and K and 1, but we certainly don't expect fluency from our emergent readers. So what is prosody? Prosody is one of those words that kids really love to learn because it's like a fancy word, but all it means is it's the use of expression when reading, and it includes all the parts. It includes the punctuation and the phrasing, and when characters get excited, all of the things that make you an interesting reader. That's prosody. And thinking back to what Dr. Rosinski said, why is fluency important? Well, fluency is important for one reason and one reason alone, and that's comprehension. One of the old KU professors used to say, comprehension trumps everything. And it makes me think of my Tanner, who is a 10-year-old boy. And if you've ever met a 10-year-old boy, they're not exactly fluent speakers, let alone fluent readers. He doesn't exactly use a whole lot of prosody and expression in his reading, but he is a good reader. So even though he might not be the most fluent reader, I know he's comprehending. And it goes the same way. You could have a reader who reads super fast and then gets done with the story and has no idea what that story is about. We call them word callers. And that's actually one of the scariest things as a teacher, is to have those word callers who seemingly read the whole story effortlessly, and then you ask them questions and they can't remember a thing what they read. So the reason we teach fluency isn't because we want all of our readers to be Shakespearean actors. The reason we teach fluency is because fluency directly has a connection to comprehension. So here's one of my favorite studies of fourth graders by Pinnell in 1995, and she's of the Fountas and Pinnell, who made the F&P books and wrote the guided reading book that we'll talk about next week. So their study found the most fluent readers were also the best comprehenders, and that a decline in oral reading fluency was marked by a corresponding decline in silent reading comprehension. And that's a really interesting point for me. So if you are a fluent oral reader, chances are you read the same way in your head. It makes me think of reading like Harry Potter. So you know that point in Harry Potter where Dumbledore asks Harry if he put his name in the thing for the Goblet of Fire, and the actor in the movie did it in such a different way than the book. In the book, Dumbledore was really concerned, and I read it that he was asking quietly with a ton of concern. And if you know, in the movie, he screams at him and he yells at him. So that I think is an example of someone who did not have this, the same reaction that I did when I was silently reading that book. But as a reader, when you're reading a book, you hear those characters in your head, and that's what that connection is. So students, it also showed that students who struggled with fluency, even if they demonstrated a high level of accuracy, so they were saying the right words, if they struggled with the other aspects of fluency, they were the ones that showed the most difficulty in reading comprehension. So, what are some strategies that increase fluency? And I think the reason fluency is one of my favorite things is because these activities are some of the students' most favorite to do as students, as readers. So repeated readings. As grown-ups, you think probably, I don't want to read a story 3 or 4 times. That sounds a little boring. But students really like it. One of the ways I did repeated readings with my students is when we would have, we read shared reading books at school, or we would do shared writing stories where we wrote a story together. Or when we did guided reading and we had our mini books, I would always send them home to read with grown-ups. And I'd make sure that we practiced it enough in school so that they could take it home, and that would be a reading that they could practice fluency with because they would have already had all the vocabulary in there. Poetry is one of my favorite things, and that's what I'm going to talk about at the end of this. Reader's theater. I'm sure you remember this as a student. This is when everybody gets a part and you practice your part and you act it out in front of the classroom. I know it was one of my students' favorite things to do. The other examples of things to do is choral or echo reading. And that's when the teacher reads a part and the students read a part, and the teacher reads a part and the students read a part. And that activity is a great activity if the purpose is for fluency. Sometimes I go into classrooms and they're reading out of their social studies book like that. That is not a good example of good reading activity. And I really miss you guys because we're going to do the popcorn reading challenge. I hereby promise that I, state your name, will never subject my students to popcorn reader because I'm better than that. You all remember popcorn reading. You sat there and you either, number one, found where you're going to read, practiced it 100 times, and sat there terrified until it was time for your turn to read. Or you just read through the whole passage, you had no idea where your spot was, and your teacher called on you and you were like, I'm done. Popcorn reading has actually no educational basis whatsoever. It's just a lazy way to read through your social studies test. Please don't, I promise, don't ever, ever, ever popcorn read with your students. Okay, now that we got the popcorn reading out of the way, we can talk about the other reading strategies. One of the strategies that we learned before in class is the language experience approach. If you remember correctly from a couple weeks ago, that is when you write a story with the students using their language and you reread it and then you put it on sentence strips. It's a fantastic way to increase fluency. Also, one of my favorite fluency increasing strategies is buddy reading. Buddy reading it can be done multiple ways. You can buddy read with partners in the same class, especially as part of a shared reading when you read a book first as a class and then you break up into partners and they can read together. The second option is buddy reading, cross-age buddy reading. We were lucky enough that when I was a sixth grade teacher, we used to go down to a first grade class and read with the first graders. And then when I was a first grade teacher, we had fifth graders that came down and read with us. And that is really neat, especially in first grade, because in the beginning of the year, our older buddies had to read to us. But then in the second part of the year, in first grade, we had learned enough that we could read to our buddies. And it's really neat to make them practice to read to someone, and it really makes it personal and ups the impact of the fluency instruction. So the last thing we're going to talk about is, let's see if I can get this. So the last thing we're going to talk about as far as strategies that increase fluency is poetry. Poetry was one of my favorite ways as a teacher to do a whole lot of different things: increase sight word vocabulary, teach concepts about print, increase students' motivation for reading, increase their confidence in reading. There's just so much that poetry does for us. But I think for me, what it did the most was give my students fluency practice. So as an example, at this time of the year, in fact, in first grade, I would always read this poem with the students. It's called It's Time for Spring, and I would cover up the poem just like I have there. We're going to pretend that that's a very nicely handwritten poem on that big chart paper, and that's a big chartboard in the classroom. So I would look at this poem with the students, and they loved poetry because I did poetry at least twice a week, and they really loved the things that we did with the poems. So I would have them look at it, and they would look at the title, and they would make a prediction, and I would say, all right, boys and girls, what do you think this poem is going to be about? And they would make predictions, and we would talk about it. And if there's any vocabulary that would be tricky, I would go over that vocabulary in the beginning. And then I would read them the poem part by part. I would say, all right, boys and girls, this poem is called It's Time for Spring. And I would say, and I would usually use a pointer, it's time for spring. My sweater's tight and itchy. My snow pants are too small. Last week I lost a mitten. I can't find my scarf at all. And then I would say, let's make another prediction. How do you think this poem's gonna end? And we would talk about it, and we'd say, what does this poem remind you of? And we'd have a good discussion. And then I'd say, all right, let's finish the poem. But my fishing rod still fits, and my baseball bat still hits. I have a kite that wants to fly, so winter, call it quits. And we'd talk about it, and I'd say, what do you think about this poem? What did you notice about it? What does it remind you of? And we'd have a whole good discussion about it. And then usually they'd end up telling me everything they can't wait for in spring as well. And then we would do some choral reading. So what would happen is I would do a line and they would do a line. So they would say, it's time for spring. And they would say, it's time for spring. And then I would say, my sweater's tight and itchy. My snow pants are too small. And then they would repeat, last week I lost a mitten. I can't find my scarf at all. They would repeat it. But my fishing rod still fits and my baseball bat still hits. And then they would repeat that. And then finally, I have a kite that wants to fly, so winter call it quits. And we would do that. And I would do this stanza and this stanza. And then I would read the whole poem and they would read the whole poem. And then they would take it back us with more room on the bottom, the student version. And down at the bottom, they would take it back to their seats, their own copy, and they would illustrate it. And then when we finished illustrating, they got with their groups, at their table groups, and they would practice reading it again. And then we would have a little contest, kind of a fake contest, that we would vote to see which table was read it the most fluently. 9 times out of 10, it was a tie. They caught on to this pretty quick, so every once in a while I'd have to actually pick a real winner. And then, and this is where it becomes slightly illegal, I would have them hole punch it, this copy, illustrated, and put it into their poetry folder. And during read to self or read to others time, that would be a time that they could practice reading their poetry. And with the big poem, which is usually on chart paper, that would be a time when they could, when it's read around the room time and when we did morning work, a lot of the times I gave them a big pointer and they could practice reading the different poems. So you can see we had a lot of different practice with this one poem, and the kids really, really liked it a lot. I also want to give you a big hint for ProSem. I have a poem for everything. I have a poem for rocks and minerals. I have a poem for Arbor Day. Poems are a really great way to have intros for your lessons. The most important thing that you have to do as a teacher, though, is to model that fluency. If you're reading out loud to your class and doing shared readings, that is the best way for to model students' fluency. You can also do explicit instruction when you're doing poetry. So I could have concentrated on the punctuation of the poem. I could have concentrated on reading the words and feeling the feelings of the authors. It was funny, a lot of times when they read this and they say, winter call it quits, you can see them, they stomp their feet and say, winter call it quits. So a lot of times when we do this poem, we talk about how is the author feeling and how does that affect how we should read it. So there's lots of different things that you can do with poetry. So I want to say thank you to all of you who hung in there with me and my first foray into recording a YouTube class. I definitely miss you all, and I know Dr. Norris misses you all too, and I would much rather be seeing you in person doing this. What you're going to do for your assignment is you're going to listen to the reader on the clip. You can see the link is not up there yet because I have not had one of my children do the clip yet, but it'll be up there. Using what you know about the aspects of literacy, which accuracy, prosody, and rate, you're going to talk with a partner or group about what you noticed. You can use Google Hangout, you can use Zoom, whatever, FaceTime, whatever works for you guys. As a group, then you're also going to reflect on why fluency is important for a reader. You can post your group thoughts, and you can do them in a video if you want to do a Flipgrid or if you want to do something else, make your own YouTube video, or you can do comments onto the discussion board. And if you have any questions, you can also add them to the discussion board as well. You'll notice on D2L, there's also an article for you to read and respond to, and there's going to be a list of fluency activities for you to do. There's also, since we took the round robin popcorn reading promise, there's a list of 11 alternatives that are actually good reading practices that I also want you to read and check out. So I hope to see you all very soon. Any questions, you can stick them in the comments or put them on D2L. Thanks.